Hey all, this is John Feingold with the Race Class Podcast. For today's episode, I am in conversation with the incredible Carliss Chatman, who is a law professor down in Dallas at SMU. Now, Carliss and I, our conversation remains incredibly, unfortunately, super relevant. Though we talked about a month ago in the beginning of April, though it took me a little while to get the conversation posted. And since then, we have continued to see many of the dynamics that we talk about in the episode, including universities engaging in anticipatory obedience, universities engaging in the repression of speech on their campuses, just the broader assault on civil rights, voting rights, multiracial democracy. Just this past Friday, the Virginia Supreme Court, in a partisan 4-3 decision, undermined the will of voters to redistrict in the same moment that we are seeing states like Tennessee and Alabama and Florida intentionally decimate the ability of Black people to vote in their states. So the moment remains, unfortunately, really ripe. And we also see universities cracking down. The president of Cornell backed their car into a student. The president of the University of Michigan sent out a public apology after a faculty member in a graduation speech just eloquently praised students who had been protesting for Palestinian human rights for opening up our collective eyes. The world is a mess, but it's conversations like this with folks like Carliss that help me to think through how we might move forward in moments like this. So I hope you listen, and I hope you enjoy. Can I actually ask you to? I actually want to stop because I want this conversation to be in the conversation.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
I can do it.
Cool. Welcome, everyone. This is the Race Class Podcast. I am here. This is John Feingold with another very cool guest. It's Professor Carliss Chatman, who's a professor of law at SMU Dedman School of Law. She teaches business enterprises, race, entrepreneurship and inequality, professional responsibility, and commercial law, which I will just footnote. I took no classes, I think, after contracts that had anything to do with corporations, nothing to do with tax, nothing on that side of the ledger, and I sort of regret it for reasons that I think will come up in this conversation. Professor Chatman, her scholarship examines how corporate personhood, contract structures, and governance norms reinforce racial capitalism and systemic inequality, all incredibly, incredibly cool. And so, Carliss, I'll just start by, welcoming you and saying thanks for coming on to the Race Class Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I do want to just start by asking you how you're doing. We talked a little bit about this before we got on. I don't want to pretend. It is sunny out where I live right now. Yesterday was 39 degrees and dreary, which seemed to better capture the mood of the planet. But I just in a real way, just want to ask how you're doing.
So, when I talk about the current times, I say two things. One, a friend of ours always says she's having a great World War III. And I say, yeah, I'm having a good if you consider it to be World War III. But the other thing I say about the current times is I am a native Texan and I am currently back in Texas. And so the rest of you just know what it's like to live in Texas. So to me, we've been, Texas was the test ground for a lot of the policies that are rolling out nationally now. So this is kind of the life I've had for the last 15 years or so. So to me, outside of, Iran, right, which is a big thing, and like kind of the global conflicts, a lot of the domestic stuff is a lot of what I'm used to, right? I graduated from high school in Texas in 1997 which was like the first post Hopwood year. So even when we talk about stuff like DEI rollbacks, like DEI has been rolling back my entire career in this state. So it's kind of old news for us, and we're good people to talk to because we've got some strategies.
So it's really interesting that you said that because through my scholarship, through my research over the past few years, I've gotten to know a principal from Texas, and then two high school teachers from Tennessee and Florida, respectively, all of whom were fired for talking about racism, essentially. And
Mm-hmm.
they were in states where they were, one of the first individual people to be collateral damage of the just grotesque right-wing reactions to the summer of 2020, to the global racial reckoning. And something that came up in conversation, because I spoke with them, the three of them did zoomed into my education law class on November 5th or November 6th, 2024. So the day or two after the election. And, their message was, we know what's coming for the entire country because our states have been laboratories for the sort of racial fascism that this administration is going to try to nationalize. And so there's ways where, yeah, they had experienced the sort of thing that now folks like me in Boston, even though we are in certain respects remain insulated from it, we understand it in a way that we did not just a little while ago.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And I think it's like, I live in Houston and teach in Dallas, and both of those are majority minority cities. And, I think all the places like Boston and New York and places that are like kind of islands, it's like you're all Houston and Dallas now, right? So, in the same way, like Houston and Dallas are nice, blue bubbles in this red state where like I don't really feel everything that happens in the rest of the state. Like sometimes I'll hear about something and I'm like, we have that in Texas? Really? I had no idea because I'm in my nice little liberal majority minority county and city where like, it's like finding regular quote unquote American food is hard for me, right? Because if you're someone who doesn't like spice, this is a hard place to live.
So in a moment, I'm gonna really dig into your expertise on the sort of the corporate side of law because
Mm-hmm.
because there's yeah for all sorts of reasons and we'll get to it. But I first want to ask, and this is a question that I ask everyone who comes on because I think I think it matters and it reveals a lot about just the way in which race and racism operate in the United States. But the question
Mm-hmm.
is, where was your racial education? Or what was your racial education? It's meant to be this very open-ended way to invite you to share when it was, where it was, how it was that you started thinking about these things that we call race and racism.
So it's interesting because whenever I talk about race and racism, I say I can understand what it's like to be a white person and like grow up in a bubble because as I said, Houston's the majority minority city. And I did not understand really that race and racism existed until I was like 8 years old and was bused to school outside of my neighborhood because I grew up in a majority Black neighborhood, middle class neighborhood. Um, one of my doctors was Jewish, and I didn't understand that meant white, which is kind of a funny story for another day. But like, my dentist was Black. Most of my doctors were Black. Every lawyer I knew was Black. Like, I just saw all of this kind of, I lived in this bubble where, one of my teachers was white, everyone else, and actually she was also Jewish, and, everyone else was Black. And so the idea that Black meant inferior was just foreign to me until I went to a mixed environment. And so, it was like trial by fire learning about racism, but also never approaching differentness as inferior, which I
Mm.
think influences the way that I approach even my scholarship or the way that I think about race. Like the idea that a Black person would not do corporate law was foreign to me. Like, why wouldn't I do economics and corporate law? Like, I see all these Black business owners where I am. Like, So the idea that there are things that I shouldn't do was strange. But when I start really, really thinking about what made me dig deep about racism, I almost am a little surprised that it took so long for my eyes to open about the racism of corporations and business and the
Interesting.
racism
So,
of contracts themselves, because I bought into the idea of markets being rational and market, like, to me corporations was the safe space. So I was an African American studies major in undergrad, and when I thought about race and economics, I thought socioeconomics and poverty and inequality. And I believed, like a lot of people still do, that if I'm talking about race, I'm talking about public accommodations, I'm talking about the civil rights movement, I'm talking about employment law. I'm not talking about corporations. That's just neutral, right? Like that's just the market. That's just market forces. And it really wasn't until I started teaching that I recognized what it means to say that the inequality in startup funds, in venture capital funds, in investing in wealth is a condition of the market. Because what you're really saying is those people are inferior. Like you're saying these people don't belong here. And this is for us only. And if only they could be good enough, they would have it. And it wasn't until I started teaching contracts and I learned about 1981 for the first time. I did not know, everyone knows what 1982 is, right? Everybody knows. And often when I talk about 1981, people are like, yeah, 1982. And I said, no, no, no. I said 1981, the contract one. And they're like, there's a contract one? Yes, there is a contract one, right? So I teach 1981 in contracts and learn about it for the first time with my students, which is kind of embarrassing, right? Because it's like I'm supposed to be a business professor and I'm supposed to be educated. And I don't even know that a statute exists that guarantees equal freedom of contract. Then I start teaching commercial law, and I just on a whim was like, I'm going to dig into the origins. Like, why do we classify lives in being this way, but crops in the ground that way, and start digging into it. And lo and behold, it's because of slavery. Like, literally, the collateral classification cases are like, well, this plantation, we're going to foreclose on it. What do we do with the pregnant slaves? What do we do with the crops in the ground? And they decide to treat the pregnant slaves the same way they treat cattle, right? And it's like in a case, like, oh yeah, yeah, obviously they're just like cattle. And it's like, whoa, in a case. And so that made me start digging into these like origins of race and contract law and race and private law, and realizing so many concepts like human capital. Like, what do you think that means? Or things like green acre, black acre, red acre. Like, what do you think? Why are we using those colors? Like, why is insurance about, where does life insurance come from? Like, why do we have salvage value? So many of the things that we just accept as norms in American business start at the slave trade. From how you put, what happens when you lose a ship full of human cargo versus a ship full of cotton, and like those different classifications and insurance norms all grow out of slavery, and none of us know anything about it, right? We just act like, oh, and we go, why does our job provide our benefits? Well, because plantations provided everything, right? It's like, and we just don't think about it. And so it kind of became my obsession. Like, I'm now totally obsessed with like making people understand, this thing that you think is just normal for business. Oh, that comes from slavery. Like, the only reason your job gives you your health insurance is because of slavery. And people are like, what? I'm like, yeah, because, and so it just became, it's like, it was my education. And then I became obsessed with educating everyone else. I am not always fun at dinner parties because of that. Because, right? Like, sometimes something happens and I'm like, that started in slavery. And then I like, kind of get on a tangent of over explaining, because it's just so fascinating to me how many things in our society start with the slave trade. And because we want to pretend like slavery didn't happen and like racism isn't real, we just pretend like it's a normal way to organize ourselves.
oh man, there's so much I want to unpack in there. So one of the just something that I've not been able to not forget. So there's a former colleague of mine at UCLA, Tony Tolbert. He has this podcast now on reparations with a friend of his, a law school buddy, and they both went to Harvard Law School. And they just did an episode on this research team that Harvard hired in 2023 in order to try to excavate all of just the identities of every person who was enslaved by Harvard, by the corporation,
Mhm.
or by one of the leaders in the 17th to like early 18th century when Harvard was, still a youngish institution. And when Harvard University brought in the research team, the university had identified 70 people who had some
Mhm.
direct link to the institution. Within about a year, the research team found over 1,000, including
Wow.
plantations in the Caribbean that were financed by either the Harvard Corporation or their like board members and faculty. And the thing that like makes so much sense in hindsight, but I never really thought about is that so Harvard is amassing wealth in the 17th, early 18th century. And Boston at the time is just this random sort of port city. And the
Hmm.
money is all from, how do you make money in that time period? International slave trade. And
Right.
so it's, and so, and then so what do you think Harvard does? They fired the research team. They
Wow.
and so one of the lead researcher was on the podcast, and he says he's pulled into these meetings with high-level administrators, and they tell him, "You are finding too many slaves."
Wow.
And and so I mean it's wild in all sorts of ways, and just the like Harvard creating this, nice glossy PR pamphlet about, reckoning with its history, but then when it actually starts to do a little digging, it shuts it
Mhm.
down, which I think speaks to, you know, just one of the dynamics that we are trapped in is that we don't, in certain respects, we understand the history, but there's so much of the details that make it far worse that we
Yeah.
just don't have access to. Um,
Hmm.
and
And that is by choice, right? I think we have to
yeah.
acknowledge that that is an affirmative choice, and it's information people don't want to hear. But then it I have actually have a reparations model as well, which is not the topic of this podcast, but I can come back and talk about it. But it makes reparations such an obvious foregone conclusion when you realize that our entire market, our entire like there is no American capitalism without slavery. I don't think there is not a single corporation in this country that cannot trace its success to the slave trade, even if it is that, I am the derivative of a company that made all of its money on the slave trade, right? And so if you think about all the people who came through Harvard at that time, um, who we think of as like our intellectual leaders and the thought leaders in our nation's history, and they were being educated with slave proceeds, then you can track, like we have to track that and give credit for it. And it really is a debt that's too big to pay, and I get that aspect of it. Like, my reparations model explicitly says this is not complete compensation, this is just what we can do for this aspect of the atrocity. But like, you have to credit the entire economy of this nation. How do we become a global leader financially? It's the slave trade, and it's not the liberty constitution part, it's the business part.
And at a minimum, Harvard could pay taxes. Like they're
At a
they're
minimum.
I mean, at a minimum, like they could pay taxes. And all right, so if did not discipline myself, I would just spend the next 45 minutes talking about the other podcast episode. I'll just drop it into the show notes so people can listen. But there's another way that it connects in, where one of the things that you were talking about before is when you have systems that are just characterized by searing inequality, where people of a particular group are excluded, the theory is either that, well, that's natural market forces, and you just have the best folks rising to the top, and the people who are not there don't cut it, or there's just some systemic distortion that we would call structural racism or something else that is causing certain people to always win and other people to always lose. And when you have an institution like Harvard that is profiting off of, one of the most abhorrent, grotesque features of, American history. at the same time that it's, literally geographically near certain neighborhoods and areas that are depressed through disinvestment. And then that's leading to recursive cycles of sort of who's getting into Harvard, who's not getting into Harvard. Then, unless you have a counter narrative or story that explains how the inequality happens, it just feeds this sort of common sense logic that, oh, this actually is a meritocracy, and it turns out that, some folks are inferior. And then if in law schools and
Right.
universities we're not actually teaching how it is that we got here, then at a minimum we're inviting these very pervasive lay theories that just presume, some people just need to work harder when it's,
Mhm.
the flip. Okay. So
Yeah.
let's veer into some of the law. And you referenced 1981 and 1982 for folks who are not that familiar with it. So it's a reference to the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that has two provisions. And
Mhm.
so this is immediately post-Civil War. And Congress is trying to figure out how you actually restructure U.S. society in ways so that people who are formerly enslaved actually can become full members of U.S. society. One provision, 1982, is really focused on property, the ability to own property, the ability to, invest in property. And 1981 is all about contracts, about entering markets in different sorts of ways. My, yeah, my guess is, yeah, like I don't know if I learned about I don't know if I learned about Section 1981 in law school at all, like maybe gesturally, but not that much. And as a matter of public discourse, 1981 has sort of returned because the same right-wing actors that are part of broader networks attempting to resegregate U.S. society and trying to make integration illegal, DEI illegal, they have essentially tried to, and somewhat successfully, resurrect Section 1981 as a tool for inequality as opposed to equality. And the Fearless Fund case, I think, is a lawsuit that some folks are familiar with. And so I guess before I invite you to talk a little bit about why it is that DEI rollbacks might actually be exposing companies to legal liability under Section 1981. If you could just give us a little more sort of grounding in that law, and then maybe use the Fearless Foundation case to, just expound on it.
Yeah. So what I find interesting about 1981 is, one thing we often link to the conservative, rollback movement is the idea of originalism. And 1981 is the only statute that explicitly uses white people as a benchmark. It says everyone should have freedom of contract that is the same as white citizens. So anytime someone says to me, we're using 1981 for reverse discrimination, I'm like, so how do you not have the same freedom of contract as a white citizen if you're a white citizen? Like, make it make sense. Like, it's just basic linguistics. The benchmark is the contracting that white people have. What I also find interesting about 1981 is what it's acknowledging. One, it's acknowledging between 1981 and 1982, we are acknowledging that property and contract is what it means to be an American capitalist. You cannot be a participant in American capitalism if you don't have property and if you can't contract about that property, right? It cannot exist. And your contract rights and your property rights have to be equal. If you don't have those rights as equal, it doesn't matter if I declare you a birthright citizen. It does not matter if I give you the right to vote. You are not an equal American if you can't contract or own property, point blank. Like, that is because we are capitalists. As long as we're capitalists, those are the rights you need. So what I find interesting about the Fearless Fund case is I litigated for 11 years before I became a law professor, and I'm a little bit of a procedure wonk. And I like to remind people what it means for a case to settle before discovery. First of all, we all say Fearless Fund lost. People are like, oh, they lost the Fearless Fund case. What they lost was a temporary restraining order. And what that means for people who don't litigate is, the lawsuit was filed, and when they filed the lawsuit, they wanted to shut their program down and to stop the competition. They appealed that and said, hey, we want to keep the competition going until we have trial. And the court said, no, I think this program is in danger of being overturned no matter what. So we're just going to stop the program. That's what they lost. They lost the ability to continue the program while they negotiated settlement or went to trial. And then they ended up settling it. But there was not an admission like, oh, this program is bad. This program violates 1981. They simply agreed to settle it. I will say that a lot of folks have said, there are just some things that those of us who do race related programs know that you're supposed to do to make it pass muster. Like, you can't have a contest and say only Black people can apply. Like, there are just some things that, do not look correct on its face. And most of the time, when we structure a program that has benefits, like you don't make it race only, you link it to economics, like there are just some tricks of the trade. And like we've been doing it since 1965. And there are just some things that you would just never do that you can't do if you're someone who does race work. And then you combine that with there are also certain things you do when you are giving out money on the corporate side to give you full freedom of contract to give your money to whoever you want. And I think in the program design, there are some flaws on both sides. There are some flaws in the way they structured it on the corporate law side. There are some flaws in the way they structured it, in the race-based program side, where it was like, I don't know that this program would stand even if it weren't like, Trump cronies being racist. And I think that is why they settled. I don't think they settled because you can never do a program like that. It is important to note that no one has said that DEI programs, race-based programs are illegal. Like that has not happened. Everything the Trump administration has done has been threats and posturing and executive orders that then get overturned. He has never won on anything racial in court yet, right? He has not won. And so I think it's important for folks to know, like, I hear people say, oh my God, Fearless Fund won, so I can't do that. And it's like, no, like Fearless Fund did not lose. Fearless Fund settled. And when you think about the cost of litigating, settlement is a rational decision if you think the program has flaws from the outset. I will also say, too, when it comes to these programs, for venture capital funds for Black women in general, and venture capital in general, 95% of venture capital funds go to white men. Not white men and white women, white men. So that 5% goes to literally everybody else, like white women, Hispanic women and men, Black men and women, everybody else who is not a white man, like just 5%. Think about how many unicorns exist. Unicorns are privately held companies that are worth over $1 billion. 100% of them are white. And 100%, and I would say 95% of them are probably white male, right? And so the idea that a program that is giving VC funds to people who are making up a fraction of 5% and that being illegal is insane, because if 1981 was allowed to do what it should do, then we'll be going after the 95%, not the 5%.
One of the things that you said actually reminded me of a conversation I recently had with Brian Socek, First Amendment free speech academic freedom professor at UC Davis, and he was referring to a different case in which a university settled. And the headlines from that case was university loses. But again, like you said, there was no actual litigation that resulted in any judgment that sided against the defendant. But you had parties that were making a decision to end the litigation in ways that giving the plaintiff what the plaintiff wanted, but not in a way that was settling law or answering any questions about law, but in part because of the way that the media was reporting what happened, it created this general understanding about the law that was wrong. And that
Mm-hmm.
then was likely going to lead to a chilling effect of lawful and beneficial behavior. And so I think it is
Right.
really important, especially when either litigators or scholars can just remind everyone to pause and not to overlearn something that happened, which is also what happened with the Harvard litigation, where there were two universities who were prohibited from continuing to employ a particular racial classification in their admissions process. It was just about admissions. It wasn't about other things. And it certainly was
Right.
not a statement on the legality of other quote unquote colorblind efforts to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion, which, if anything, the case was signaling you should do that stuff,
Right.
and that racial diversity remains, constitutionally a good thing. I have to, though, also, so Section 1981, what you described is how it baselines to white people. It's the law. The actual text of the law says everyone has to have the same rights as people who are white. And I'm just going to read it again. So,
Mhm.
Section 1981 provides that, quote, all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall have the same right in every state and territory to make and enforce contracts, as is enjoyed by white citizens. Also, like you said, if we all want to be originalists, then what we cannot do is say, oh, the Supreme Court has interpreted some law from 1964 in one way. That's
Mhm.
language is different than this law from 1866. And if you want to understand Fearless Fund or any domain in which white dudes have 95% of the market, which, like, you are a Pete Hegseth type to suggest that that sort of system is something that reflects merit, but to have everyone else only have access to 5%, and then one of, those other groups say, you know what? The whole market does not provide, so we're going to try to find a way for us to be able to enter the market. And then to suggest that that is inconsistent with this law that says everyone is to sort of enjoy the same rights to make and enforce contracts as enjoyed by white citizens, you actually can't get there unless you ignore the text of the law.
Right. And they have never won, right? The Northwestern lawsuit, didn't that one got dismissed or it's gone, right? Like no white, I mean, there is one case like from like the 70s, um, where and it's an employment case. And I like to point out that, like, 1981 gets lumped with Title VII a lot, and it gets lumped with other things a lot. And, as John said, from the 60s. And so, people kind of interpret that as, well, it's they lost on 1981 grounds. It's like, but actually I think it's more the Title VII part, right? Like, and so there's a couple of cases where, you know, a white person's disciplined differently than the black employees. You just don't see it in any other context. Like, these cases are so rare, but people love to hang their hat on, well, here's this one case from 1968 where a white man was reverse discriminated against, and therefore we can use 1981 for reverse discrimination forever. And it was just such a rare, it's like a rare, like, that has never happened to you. That's not what happened to you, sir. I promise you that is not what happened to you. You've not been the other thing I hate too, though, is this term reverse discrimination. And it's kind of like the term market forces, because when you say reverse discrimination, you are tacitly acknowledging that you think discrimination only happens to people of color, right? Because why else would you use the word reverse? Why wouldn't you just say I was discriminated against instead of saying I was reverse discriminated against? And to me, it signals the baseline that Congress signaled when they benchmarked white citizens. You think there's a set of rights, there's a set of standards that you should receive as a white person, and anytime there's a deviation from that, you are calling it reverse discrimination, right? Because you truly believe you should not and should never be discriminated against.
Yeah, and reverse racism, like the term preferential treatment or racial preference, has been part of this vocabulary that's been developed in order to reframe civil rights remedies as themselves the threat to civil rights. And I used to do this, sort of playful exercise in class that I think I called it affirmative action math. And so you catalog all of the ways in which any system being closer to whiteness through identity or otherwise
Mm-hmm.
leads to advantages that are untethered to anything that one would sort of describe as meritocratic or a rational way to make decisions. And you tally it all up. So I don't know, you get 7 things, you get 25 things, whatever the number is. And then you ask, okay, so how do you, like, if the goal is a quote unquote race neutral process, how do you get there? And it means, oh, you have to either get rid of all of those inputs, or you have to have some, countermeasures that move you closer to net zero. And the reverse discrimination language like ends up reframing all those countermeasures as somehow being the same thing and equally damaging and equally, distorting as the stuff that's creating the distortion. And then the claim is so you can't do countermeasures. But that just means you're in a system that's overwhelmingly saturated in white privilege, which,
Right.
leads to results where 95% of the goodies get, obtained by a particular group. And then that is, perceived or depicted as somehow fair and neutral.
Hmm.
So,
Now, the way I translate that concept, and this may be a good segue to what you're probably about to ask me, but
yeah.
um, the way I translate that concept to contracting is a concept I call white economic comfort. And in
Oh,
my
yeah. I
1981
was
article,
just going to quote that. Yeah, perfect.
yeah, yeah, in my 1981 article is where I kind of first, launched this theory. And the idea behind white economic comfort is that if you think about 1981 as a contract statute and you think about what makes up contracting in America or across the board, right? Offer, acceptance, consideration, absence of defenses. You also can have unspoken conditions precedent and to a contract, things that must exist for the contract to occur. And I think about white economic comfort as one of those conditions precedent, which means the reason you say it's reverse discrimination and reverse racism is you are saying that for a contract to happen, I must be comfortable as a white person, right? I must be comfortable as a white person. And the default for contracting for me as a white person is to contract with another white person, absent some special circumstance that allows me to feel comfortable contracting with a non white person. So anytime you bring in affirmative action or DEI, you are violating my condition precedent of white economic comfort. That is what I expect every time I contract, that it is going to be something that makes me happy, that makes me feel optimal. And it doesn't matter that that's not economically efficient to only contract with other white people, or it's economically inefficient because the best qualified person for the position is a Black woman. The Black woman makes me uncomfortable, and my condition precedent is my economic comfort as a white person.
So I was not familiar with this concept until, or like in prepping a little for today's conversation, I started reading your 1981 piece. And it's so good. And it connects with like, other bodies of scholarship that are sort of approaching it from a similar um, sort of way. And I want to read a little bit from the piece. This is just the very beginning. And you've already started responding to it, but the piece opens, the persistent racial wealth gap is difficult to address because of three intervening forces. The preservation of white economic comfort as a condition precedent to contracting, the inferior personhood status of Black persons, and the role the government plays in reinforcing these norms through facially neutral racialized barriers to contracting. And there's more that I want to get into, but then I would just read the whole thing. But the, so I guess just a personal story. So before I began my law professor job at BU, I had an administrative role at UCLA, and I also started I formed an LLC. Well, actually, I had to get a law school friend to help me form it because I did not take corporations and had no idea what was the corporate structure that I needed or wanted and how to do it. But fortunately, John Tobin, who other folks, should reach out to, he helped us out. And my partner, Dr. Evelyn Carter, she's been on this podcast a couple times, Black woman, incredible, sophisticated social psychologist, and just thinker about race. So she brought all that stuff in. I brought in some of the legal and other stuff. And one thing that we learned early on from the consulting work was that it was so emotionally taxing in ways that were uneven for the two of us, but even for me, even, as cisgendered white guy, when you're pretty constantly moving through spaces and having to deal with, at best just recalcitrance to, dealing with the racism in institutions, it's taxing. And we were like, oh, it's America, so let's charge for it. And so we added to just our standard contract this, I think it was like 1.5% or a 3% fee that we called the reparations tax. And part of it was partly a test to see like
Mhm.
whether an organization was going to be uncomfortable with that language. And if it is, then we're probably not ready to, work. And there were places where we had to have a sit down and they're like, John and Evelyn, do you have to call it that? And we're like,
Mm.
yes, we do. We do have to call it that. And I never really thought about it in the language of white economic comfort, but just that language of reparations
Mhm.
created white economic discomfort.
Right.
And
And then they didn't contract with you because you violate the condition precedent. Yeah.
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 Um, all right. So I want to pivot a little bit because one of the things you wrote an op-ed, and I have it pulled up here from about a year ago. And this was when we were beginning to see a lot of the DEI rollbacks in the higher education domain, in the corporate sector. And I was concerned for a lot of different reasons, but I've also, for a number of years, been really dissatisfied with the lack of creativity and ingenuity on the left and in progressive circles to try to re-own civil rights laws and not just let reactionary right-wing
Mhm.
forces define what civil rights law means, even against the backdrop of an incredibly hostile Supreme Court. And so I'm just always so drawn when I see people marshal not just creative, but very well-grounded sort of legal arguments that sort of flip the script a little bit. And so you wrote this great op-ed that I'll also link to that titled DEI Rollbacks Create Legal Governance Risks Under Section 1981. And part of what you're saying is that the way in which certain institutions were cutting DEI programs, it wasn't just morally objectionable, but actually created legal liability, and we should understand it as such. And so I was wondering if you could walk us through that a
Yeah.
little bit, because I think it's such an important point, but for different reasons, not intuitive to a lot of people. And then leads to a, a way in which institutions internalize legal risk that could be recalibrated if they understood, well, there's this other sort of legal exposure that you're just not incorporating into your risk analysis.
Right. So the idea behind the article was kind of the foundation of 1981. And I actually got the idea from reading the pleadings in one of these reverse discrimination lawsuits, where, it was saying because this company has a vendor program, they are not contracting with me because I am a white man and therefore it violates 1981. And then as companies started rolling it back because of these lawsuits, I'm like, well, what if the reverse is true? Because these white men are complaining, I am not contracting with Black businesses because they are Black, right? Like, if the only reason you are denying, like when you roll back, like let's say you don't have preferences anymore and you decide you're getting rid of preferences. But if you look at a Black business and say, I'm afraid to contract with them because the white men are going to accuse me of reverse discrimination, then you are making an affirmative positive decision to not contract with a Black person simply because they are Black, which then violates 1981. So it becomes very circular. It's like if you roll back your program and you never contract with another Black business because they are a Black business, to me, that's a 1981 violation. And what also made me inspired by it to think about this, that's when the Target boycotts were happening. And kind of anecdotally on social media, the various Black businesses that were vendors of Target were saying that their contracts were being canceled or like their contracts were not being renewed. And I've put this on social media multiple times. No one will respond to me. And I'm quite sure it's because of how Target is writing their contracts, but I'll say it again. If anyone wants to send me their Target vendor contract, one of my RAs and I have been for a year trying to get some Target contracts and see how the cancellations happened because we want to see if there's a company that has done this and we heard about it. But I assume they've got some non-disclosure, non-competes that are making these people afraid of, being sued out of business. If that why we haven't seen it. But, literally Target says we're not doing DEI anymore. And suddenly, oh my God, all these Black vendors are no longer being used. If they were not using Black vendors simply because they were Black vendors, and there isn't some other market justification for it, that is a 1981 violation. Now, what makes 1981 hard is the Comcast case, where like I think everyone except for Sotomayor said you need but for causation. And so if you're going to prove that you were discriminated against for 1981, you need to prove that race is the only reason. Like it can't have a market reason too, which is just ridiculous, right? Like it's just, and in part of the paper, I talk about how why are we treating a contract like a tort? Contracts don't have but for causation. Like what are we talking about here? And lots of people will say, well, because it's a civil rights statute. And I'm like, civil rights aren't automatically torts, but that's another very long conversation. But I think it will be hard to prove that the only reason Target is dropping these companies or whoever is dropping these businesses because they are Black businesses. But sometimes there's a smoking gun. And so I really, really hope someone who's had their contracts dropped will sue under 1981, because perhaps we will see in discovery that nice email from a CEO or a CFO that says, well, we can't contract with Black businesses anymore, we're going to get sued, and then I've got my proof that I need that fits the Supreme Court standard. But the whole point is rollbacks aren't legally neutral. If you are rolling back your preferential program and that results in a completely biased program, that also is the 1981 violation that you were worried about with your preferential program.
And I actually think one can take it both farther, and there's ways in which the argument can be translated into a lot of similar sorts of contexts. So I think about Ricci, the case involving New Haven firefighters, in which the city of New Haven decided not to certify a test because of the disparate impact that it had. And one of the arguments that they made was that under Title VII, there was disparate impact liability, and they made the decision because they were worried that if they had certified the test, they would have been legally liable. And what the Supreme Court said is that you have to show a strong basis in evidence. They're like, you didn't have enough evidence that had you done this thing, you would have been legally liable. And so therefore, you were making a quote unquote race-based decision. There's lots of ways that one can sort of rightly read Ricci narrowly. But to the extent we're in this moment where you have folks on all sides that are sort of strategically characterizing certain things as race-based because they want to put it into this category of legally suspect. Well, if you're a company and you are eliminating lawful programs that ensure that people from particular sort of racial groups, gender groups are able to access it, then that is as race-based or gendered-based as the thing that happened in Ricci. And if there's no like market justification, and the only justification is that, well, someone sued you, then at least according to Ricci, you have to be able to show that what you were doing was not lawful. And to the extent what you're doing is lawful, then that's not going to be a sufficiently compelling justification. But then also in like the admissions context, my guess is there's a number of institutions that are worried that if they admit a sufficient number of Black students through fair processes, they're going to get sued for it because someone is going to allege that they're doing something unfair because there are quote unquote too many Black students there. But that's then racial balancing. Then that's doing the thing that the Supreme Court said that you can't do. And so there's all these ways in which intentional, and then just more broadly, to the extent the Trump administration, everything that it does that is designed to reduce the number of, women or Black people or, name the protected category group, that's all unlawful too, under under the Fifth Amendment. And so it's just, I think the idea invites, us to think about in many different contexts how institutions that dismantle programs that we would think of as DEI, either internally or through governmental coercion, that dismantling is unlawful itself.
Now, here's what I find interesting from the corporate standpoint. I had a recent op-ed that was about the fact that the Trump administration is essentially bullying us with these executive orders and with these administrative actions because every time they go to court, they lose. And so if you're complying in advance, right? So if you throw in, the things that you and I just talked about with the fact that you're complying in advance for something that the government loses on every single time, from a corporate standpoint, it starts to invoke business judgment rule and fiduciary duties. If you know that there's a chance that you're going to get in trouble for what you're doing because what you're doing is now actually a 1981 violation and discrimination, you're advance complying with a law that is wrong, and that everyone who complies in advance suffers market harm, right? Look at what's happened to Target. Look at what's happened to the law firms that
I
complied
was
in
going to ask
advance.
you about those law firms. Yeah.
Right. So everyone who's advance complied has lost. No one is a winner when they advance comply. The government keeps losing. You're doing it anyway. Is that reasonable business judgment, or is that just high risk behavior such that you're now subjecting yourself to fiduciary duty liability and other liability? Right. So, it's interesting. A year ago, everyone was like, oh, I'm so afraid. We can't have our conference. We can't do this. We can't do that. But now that we've had some test cases, the opposite has become true, right? It's become totally cyclical. If you're advance complying, you need to think about why. And I call that values primacy, right? You got to think about what your values are, right? If you are dropping your program because it was face value only and you were trying to get some marketing brownie points post George Floyd, and so it's not really what you care about as a company, well, yeah, go ahead and roll that back. It was only ever face value. But if you've got some programs that are embedded in the structure of your company, you believe in it, and it's who you are as a company to have these goals. If you've got business evidence that look at how much better our company is since we have done these programs, rolling it back is the real risk, not keeping it.
So there's one sort of more big question that I want to ask, and I think what I'll say now will sort of bridge into it. It is just sort of leaning into your point about how just from a pure business perspective, the advanced compliance is bad for business. And the law firm example, I think, is a really good one in the way that the firms that caved, they lost talent because people left them. They suffered tremendous reputational harm. And the firms that stood up, at least in the legal sector, I'm speaking for myself, I have respect for them in a way that I
Mm-hmm.
have none for the others.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of the others, you learn more things that come out. It's like, oh, you got a lot of issues to deal with. So I had a conversation with a friend who's now a junior partner at a big firm in the South. And I just called him because I was like, look, are you all going to play any fights to save democracy? I was like, I just need to know, should I be spending my time trying to connect with big firm lawyers and big firms that you can throw around those dollars you have in order to join the fight? And he was like, look, John, so me and a couple of other junior partners, we really wanted to sign on to one of the amicus briefs supporting one of the law firms that was targeted by the Trump executive order. And the managing partner in the firm called us into his office and he was like, can't do that. And he was like, and you all need to remember that you now have a fiduciary duty to the firm. Because if we sign this, then we're going to shed clients, and what's that going to happen to, what everyone takes home at the end of the day? And one of the stories that we're learning is, and one could say a lot of things about that, but that might just be wrong as a
Mm-hmm.
matter of, just the business, just the financial interest of the firm, that signing the brief, even if it attracts some attention from the regime, is actually the thing that you need to do if you want to be attracting clients and, maintaining the reputation that you want to have. And so,
I think you have
yeah.
to remind people that switching lawyers is hard, right? That part too. If I've been with Skadden for 30 years as a corporation, and they've got you can't just fire Skadden overnight. So I never bought that argument that we're going to shed clients if we're at odds. You might lose the M&A deal that is going before the FTC in 6 months because they don't know what the political climate is going to be. You might lose a matter, but you are not going to lose an entire book for signing an amicus brief. Just like you're not like people couldn't leave the firms that capitulated either. Like it is very, very hard to switch counsel, like mid-trial, mid-deal. So the whole like that whole justification was always bogus. Like, you know, like the amount of money, the amount, like it can matter on the margins, like this one case, this one deal. But we can see 1 year later, you're going to suffer 1 year, right? At the most. Like all you need is one good trial to know which way or the other to go. So you may as well stick to your values. Like, what are your values as an institution or as an individual, right? Do with what your values say. Now, if you're anti DEI, let us know, right? So we can know who you are. But if you think it's a good idea and you like it as a business case, then stick with it. I use Tractor Supply as my example because I'm in Texas and I go to Tractor Supply. But I never expected Tractor Supply to have a DEI program. I don't know if you've been in a Tractor Supply.
Tractor Supply, it's the Home Depot.
Yeah, it's like a Home Depot, but farm equipment,
Mm-hmm.
ammo, ivermectin. Right? Remember when that was the thing?
Oh, all right. Yeah, for
You
your
can get
horse
that.
or for your
Yeah,
COVID.
right. You can get that. That's where people are getting it, like because you can get it at Tractor Supply. I do not expect that place to have DEI. I go there because I have a lot of dogs and I need things, but when people were like Tractor Supply rolled back their DEI, I was like, oh, they had it? Like it was a surprise, but it is a surprise when Target does it because every Black woman in America shops at Target, or they used to, right? So it's all about what your underlying values are. And there's some of those law firms, like I worked at Southern law firms in Houston. I did not expect any of them to defend the rule of law, right? And people who I respect work there, and I went to work there, but I live in Houston and I needed a job, right? It like there are just certain things I didn't expect. They've always been more conservative firms. Like the shock to me was the New York firms where I know that hired former, Biden administration people and former Obama administration people, and like, parade them out. Like that was the shock for me, right? When the typical, Southern, we only do corporate law or only do oil and gas firm, like notice that we don't even know their names because it's not
Mm-hmm.
surprising what they
Yeah.
did. It's
Yeah.
it's it's when it upsets what we think someone's values are that it's disruptive.
So let me ask one final question, just, and feel free to go deep or not, however you want to take it. But so you participated in and are writing an essay as part of the symposium that we had at BU in the fall on the relationship between universities and democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And my big take is that universities across, by and large, have and continue to, in many different ways, enable the rise of racial fascism in the United States. And I guess I'm just, yeah, curious for your sort of how you see just yeah, how you are thinking about universities. And I don't mean to conflate the very diverse, heterogeneous sector that is higher education. But yeah, I would just sort of love your how you're thinking about universities right now, and maybe from a corporate perspective, because one of the reasons why one of the things that I have become much more attuned to over the past couple of years is how little I had been thinking about the corporateness or the corporate structure of universities, including the one that I'm a part of, and how that it helps to explain in different sorts of ways why universities are acting in the ways that they are, and in ways that in many cases surprise me, even as someone who has spent a decade writing about the ambivalence that elite institutions have towards racial equality. I was still surprised. I was surprised in 2024. I was surprised in 2025. I'm no longer surprised. I'm just disappointed with many humans, and the institutions that they exist in.
Yeah. When I think about, why so many people don't do corporate and don't do, contracts and commercial stuff, right? That is by design, right? The other people on my side are trying to embargo the information and make it seem so complex and so difficult that people can't understand it so that we can do the evil, dirty things that we do over here without anyone knowing until it's too late. And I think universities are actually one of the best examples of that Because I think, we say universities are where ideals happen and it's where democracy happens, but truthfully, we've been performing democracy at universities. And my article is literally called Performing Democracy, because I think that's how the only way you can describe universities. And, I'm not a education scholar, but we've probably been performing democracy at universities since the 60s. If we really thought deep and hard about it. And we've got this kind of corporatization of universities. And so, I say to all my friends who are professors, anytime something goes wrong, or anytime like a president, usurps power and like they're surprised he has the power to do it, I will say that's because you don't realize you're working at a corporation and you don't know how corporations work. And people at universities know they're only like everyone at the business school knows how corporations work. Everyone in the economics department knows how corporations work. But on the law faculty, at most, there are 5 people who know. So if you think about the larger scheme of a university, you only got 2 departments and 5 people at a law school you got to worry about, and you can do whatever the hell you want. And that is what we have happening at universities. It's that most of us have no idea how corporate governance works. The number of times that I have sat in a faculty meeting and said, what do the bylaws say? And people say, why does that matter? Like, because we're a board and like it's like we're doing corporate things, but when you don't know, people can sneak things up on you. And so I think the anticipatory compliance that we see universities doing out in the open, they've been doing for a while, but they've just been complying to trustees, to rankings, to market forces. Right? Like it is very much a corporate thing that is happening in our universities. When we look at the kind of students we admit, even, right? And the kind of people we hire, we are making very corporate type decisions at our schools. And we're saying it's in the name of merit, or we're saying it's in the name of prestige, or we're saying, we're building an intellectual community, but we're really just being very, very corporate about it. And we're trying to appease US News, or we're trying to get, the good headline, right? We're not actually in the business of education. We're in the business of an educational reputation. And it makes me sad because, I thought I was leaving that when I left corporate and left practice. But I feel like increasingly universities look a lot more like the law firms and places that I worked before. And I wish it didn't. But I mean, I think we do still have intellectual freedom. Like, I think I can write whatever I want, but I don't know. I think I think I can teach whatever I want. I think I probably am self-censoring a little bit. And I probably have been for a while, even though I hate to admit it, and I think we all do. And when I self-censor, I don't self-censor what I write. I think I will never give that up. But sometimes when I self-censor what I teach, the thought process is, do I feel like fighting about this? Right? It's like, do I feel like I want to teach my race and entrepreneurship seminar and I want people to leave me alone on that? So am I really, really going to fight when I teach contracts and corporations? Like, I'm picking my battles and I'm doing it subconsciously all the time, which is a form of self-censorship. But it's because I'm just working at another corporation that will anticipatorily comply if enough money's on the line. Or if a donor said, I work at a private institution, you work at a private institution, and people love to say we have more freedom because we're private. But the truth is, if I'm at a public institution, I'm beholden to the state. If I'm at a private institution, I'm beholden to some random trustee who's donating a whole lot of money, which is actually a little more fascist. No, that was a horrible way to end this conversation.
No,
But,
that was no. I was not cutting that off. You would be proud, I think, because and so this came from a conversation either that we were having or that I heard you. But I was in a faculty meeting recently about um, strategic planning, and I was like, I'm pretty sure we need access to the budget if we're going to be doing any planning, because then what else are we up to? Um, but it's also, I mean, so interesting when you're saying, so the econ department, like they get it, business gets it, the 2 lawyers. Right now, in red states and blue states, universities are eliminating the other departments. They're eliminating humanities, a lot of the social sciences, and, all the ethnic studies programs. And these are all the sites within the institution that are at least aspirationally democratic.
Yep.
And so, there's a real sinister, you know, um, flavor to the way in which the liberal universities in the deep blue cities are just, restructuring just the departments, the sites of knowledge production, the people that are there. And then, certainly with law has long been a conservative field in different sorts of ways, particularly with respect to race. And now, there's a lot of states in the country where you will have schools that will not hire someone who teaches about race, who teaches about trans rights, because they're concerned that they'll be able to keep them, either because they'll leave or because they know that the provost via the trustees, is not going to grant them tenure. And so there's so many dynamics at play. Um,
No, it's fascinating. I also think, what bothers me about universities is how in demand I am, which is very counterintuitive. But I think it is a sign, and I viewed it as a sign. Um, Probably, I mean, maybe like around 2017, 2018, how every law school, almost nearly every law school, is obsessed with expanding their business law. And I love business law. So I think more people should understand it. But, every school is expanding business law. Every school is growing their business schools and is talking about executive MBAs and these kind of MBAs and more business undergrads. Every school is like, oh, no, no, the kids need STEM. Everyone needs STEM. And I feel like when everyone was pushing STEM, my point was, but like, why don't we want humanities? Like, why are we acting like students only need the STEM? And I read that a while ago. Like,
yeah.
it's not that kids need to know more STEM because tech is hot. It's like you don't want them going in the English department and reading Toni Morrison and getting like radicalized, right? You don't want
Yeah.
them reading James Baldwin. You don't want them doing that. So if you push everyone towards STEM or business, then you can create an entire generation of people who are even more unaware than we are now.
Yeah, and then if you just realize that you're in some factory for just to produce worker widgets for
Mm-hmm.
Amazon or Google or whoever, that takes the magic out of it. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Carlos. This was a great conversation. I'm so glad you were able to join.
Yeah, me too. I've been following the podcast and I'm like, I need to do that. And I'm glad you reached out because, we always have these long, long to-do lists. And so,
Yeah.
it was nice.